Hey everyone, welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief of iPolitics, and I'm joined as always by Brian Storseth, our publisher. And today, we got the whole iPolitics family here with our major projects reporter, Dufour, and our other reporter, Davis Legree, all joining us for today's show. Thanks to all of you for joining us. It's not shaping up to be another busy week here in Ottawa and Toronto as we all prepare for, I guess, the inevitable holiday slowdown. But I mean, can it top the theatrics of last week when we had a cabinet minister resign over a decision that we knew was going to be contentious regarding the Alberta deal, and kind of wondering what that means for that kind of Liberal voting coalition? I'll start with you, Brian. Steven Guilbeault, I know he's not terribly beloved in your parts, in your hometown or in your home neck of the woods, if you want to call it that. And I'm being very charitable here. Do you think this actually matters at the end of the day, that someone with Guilbeault's, polarizing reputation and merely his baggage, do you think it really hurts the Liberals going forward?
Well, I think anytime you lose your Quebec lieutenant, it's going to hurt you moving forward. Does it hurt you in Alberta and Western Canada? No, but yeah, he was the Quebec lieutenant. Clearly, he has a lot of responsibility on getting people elected in Quebec for the Liberal Party. And a lot of places, I understand they used his signs, they used his likeness and names. Yeah, that it's definitely going to hurt, but it does show a crack inside the cabinet and inside what we were talking about last week, Marco, when we were talking about the fact that they now have an environmental caucus. That clearly there are things that the Liberal members of Parliament and caucus feel that they need to defend and protect certain positions that they didn't need to defend and protect while Trudeau was Prime Minister. I think the Guilbeault departure will definitely have an impact. Mark Miller coming in, everything old is new again. So it's not like they went with, a fresh face like Gasparo or somebody like that. I guess they felt like they needed to replace a Quebec minister with a Quebec minister, but it's not a good sign for the Liberals.
It's interesting, Brian, you said they use Guilbeault on their campaign signs. I feel like the Conservatives should have done that in Alberta. Like this guy was the boogeyman for everything energy related. I spoke with a Newfoundland and Labrador government source, or former government source, I should say, just last week, and they said Guilbeault's name alone was enough to kind of deter investment in the oil and gas sector. So I get what you're saying is like this guy is the green poster child. Davis, that kind of departure of someone who became, for better or for worse, the center of all that talk and discussion around the government's environmental policy. Do you think, in a way, this move maybe signals that Mark Carney is walking away from these climate commitments? Do you think, it's just an evolution, or what's your read on the kind of mood in the Liberal camp?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's kind of a continuation of what we've seen over the past few months. I think we even spoke about it a little bit a couple of weeks ago about how this consistent rolling back of climate measures is kind of stripping away from that narrative that a lot of, especially older progressives, had during the election campaign, that Mark Carney was a strong progressive alternative to Pierre Poilievre. A lot of people keep citing his book values and whether he still adheres to those principles that he outlined there. But obviously, for Guilbeault, this was just one step too far. He mentioned in his statement of resignation that he took issue with the scaling back of those climate policies. But I think the idea of a new pipeline through BC to the Pacific Coast for a guy who co-founded Equiterre, one of the more prominent environmental groups in this country, that would just be tough to square publicly. And obviously, when you have cabinet solidarity as a core tenet of our system, that leaves him with very few options.
Yeah, and I mean, Davis and I, you guys both know that we were discussing heavily in the run-up to the budget vote, what, the kind of math that this government faces, and knowing that it's going to be a tough, pill to swallow. It's interesting to learn that Guilbeault was one of those people who is tasked with getting Elizabeth May on board, and now she's saying, I felt like I was kind of sold a bill of goods, right? Some of these promises that looks like Steven Guilbeault or some assurances offered seem to be totally upended by that MOU. And I, of course, I always bring this up every time we talk about the budget, was you questioned about how, it could find a political dance partner for this government. Do you think this makes life even more difficult for this government when it comes to negotiating with other parties?
Well, I think we've seen so far is that no one wants a Christmas election. So this question will be for next year. And then I wonder too, like we're still waiting on the details of the pipeline, right? So far, the Carney government has been able to dodge and deflect by saying they don't comment on hypotheticals, even though the memorandum of understanding that we saw last week was very specific for a hypothetical project. But I mean, once we do have those details out, I would imagine we would see that shakeout in government and see how that changes the calculus for a confidence motion. But we already know they probably won't have Miss May voting in favor of them anymore. But then I don't know if we'll see dissent within the Liberal caucus. I don't imagine so. And pipeline politics are strange. I mean, I don't know. I would put the question to you guys. You know, did Trans Mountain cost Justin Trudeau quite a bit politically?
No, not really. I mean, you can read it in terms of, people that left. No one. I mean, I just remember the kind of swarm of MPs who got questions, especially people like Terry Beach, who represented that riding that was a determinist. No one left. Everyone said, we're going to make sure we're going to hold them to account to make sure they follow those conditions that I guess at the time was the Energy Board approved it. I don't know, Brian. Like, did you think it actually cost him? It feels like there was a lot of hubbub about how they were going to oppose it, and then the BC MPs were like, "Oh, okay, I guess we're doing this," and everyone just kind of went on with it.
Well, our parliamentary system, as I've experienced, doesn't exactly empower a lot of courageous members of parliament to stick and fight with the center on things. At the end of the day, they usually twist themselves into knots to figure out a way to get behind. As used to be said to us often enough, if you want to be in cabinet, vote like you're in cabinet already. It's a pretty compelling measure for a lot of the government and opposition MPs. But I think is a bigger piece of this, and this has a great point on pipeline politics, but removing the tanker ban, right? Like cap on oil and gas emissions being removed, the net zero clean energy regs, like this was a win for Danielle Smith. These were all the things that she's talked about and ranted on being a deterrent to the economy. So my question is Prime Minister Carney actually agreeing with Premier Smith on what some of the underlying things that need to happen to move the economy forward were? And in doing that, was the Trudeau government, is he saying the Trudeau government was in the way of the economic growth in the country, right? These are kind of some of the more key questions, I think, coming out of this. Pipeline, is there going to be a proponent? Is there not going to be a proponent? But these other aspects are real movement away from the Trudeau government environmental policy, and what impacts that going to have. I don't think you're going to see one MP move away from the government on this, but you may see their voting coalition start to dissipate. And are you really going to gain anything in Alberta in regards to voting coalition?
I'd like to get, sorry, Davis, I was just going to say, I would like to get your thoughts on not only what Brian just said, but something I was told. I spoke to, I'm going to butcher his pronunciation, Sandy Skembry. He used to be a policy director for Wilkinson, and he said actually it's Danielle Smith who's the one who's going to be exposed to a lot of risk because the government has created a pathway saying, look, we're getting rid of all those or most of those quote unquote bad laws. So now it's really, the ball's really in your court right now, Premier Smith. If you can't get a pipeline done with these conditions, it's kind of on you. You can't use us as a scapegoat anymore. What do you think about that, Davis?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I don't profess to be an expert in Alberta politics. I'll leave that for Brian to comment on. I think what you just said seems absolutely right to me. She seems like she's gotten most of, if not everything, she's wanted for, and even that clip that kind of emerged shortly after the announcement from the UCP convention where she was getting booed after expressing her commitment to a sovereign Alberta within the United Canada, not comments that most people would think would be controversial, but it elicited a course of boos in that room. So yeah, I'll be really curious to see how she plays this, especially if things start to go south and it appears that the pipeline will never actually materialize. I don't know where she can pivot at this point. I did want to go back, if it's okay, Brian. I wanted to ask you a question because I'm very curious. We talked on about it a little bit here about the political dynamics in the House moving forward. Now that in the post-MOU world, if we can say that, if we assume that the Conservatives still do not want an election, which based on the results of the last confidence vote with 2 abstentions and Andrew Scheer seemingly making sure that he was available to abstain just in case that the votes didn't go their way. How do they proceed? Are they able to vote with the government in confidence votes because that they have seemingly endorsed a pathway towards a pipeline? As Marco mentioned, Elizabeth May is no longer on board to help the government survive these confidence measures. I spoke to Gord Johns, one of the two new Democrats who abstained and helped the budget pass last month, and he seemed very pissed off about this pipeline. He seemed like as if he was going to be unwilling to abstain moving forward in confidence votes. So if the Conservatives are still interested in avoiding an election, what options do they have at their disposal here?
Well, I think in the House of Commons, you're going to see a more traditional minority parliament. You're going to see opposition parties are always going to do what's in their best interest. And as long as the Carney government looks like they would go from a minority to a majority, they will find a way to get behind something. And I think it's in each of their best interests to make sure that happens. So I have no doubt that that's where this is going to happen. And look, Davis, at the end of the day, Elizabeth may say today that the pipeline was a bridge too far after she's already cast her vote, but February is a whole different ball of wax on different conditions that could come up. And so, yeah, I think that at the end of the day, the tougher question is going to be, because everybody says, well, the general narrative that I hear, at least expressed by all the talking heads, which I guess we're kind of are now too, is that there's just no proponent and there's no possibility that there's going to be a proponent. But what happens if there is? What happens if there is a proponent that comes forward and this does become more real? It's going to, I think, call the bluff of perhaps the Liberals in where they're going with this, and also the Conservatives, because you may end up in a situation where the Alberta government saying, hey, we don't want an election right now because we're getting what we want. So how does that affect the Alberta Saskatchewan Conservatives as well, which Pierre is one of at this point in time? So this could get really interesting. I'm not convinced that there is a lot of political upside for the Prime Minister out of this, but as he said at the press gallery dinner that we're all at, that he doesn't profess to be a great politician. Maybe he is truly just trying to get things done in this country.
Yeah, and I know you're a big believer in Vive la Alberta Libre. We're going to get a independence movement in Alberta to go with our longer-lasting one in Quebec. To Brian's point about how if there wasn't a proponent that emerged, some of those preconditions the Prime Minister talked about, are those just like a bridge too far? Even if Enbridge or whatever tried to revive the Northern Gateway project, it still seemed like some of these conditions, like getting Indigenous consent, getting buy-in from the BC government, it still seems like it's really tough to envision how all that comes together.
It is. I mean, we've heard BC Premier David Eby saying he would be open to talking about pipelines as long as the tanker ban remains in place. That would mean another pipeline to Vancouver. Kind of defeats the point, because the goal is to cut on that transit time that it takes to go to Asia. Because if you ship from Prince Rupert, I think it's 1 or 2 days shorter in terms of transit to get your goods to Asian markets. So I think, I don't know, if I had to guess, speculate about the future, I think there might be a way that you could have the route go to Prince Rupert, and you could kind of spin it in a way where you can say, okay, the tanker ban remains in place, except we're going to adjust it, make an appropriate adjustment, and carve out that little bit by Prince Rupert. Maybe there's a way that tanker bans can go through that route without actually going in the Hecate Strait, which is the big concern, right? That's the strait that's very dangerous for shipping. Although this is something that has come up, as the tanker ban was being developed, could we consider amendments? Could we consider exemptions? Could we consider corridors that this wouldn't apply or would apply differently? And the answer was always, it'd be like allowing a smoking table in a non-smoking restaurant. If there's a spill, it affects the whole area, not just the corridor in which you gave this exemption. I don't know if politically there's a way to spin it where you say, okay, it's just that little carve out in the north. It won't even affect the region that's super sensitive, even though it does ultimately kind of defeat the purpose of having the tanker ban in the area generally. In terms of First Nation consent, I mean, there are some First Nations we haven't heard from, who have been supportive of Northern Gateway in the past, who have bought equity stakes. And we're already hearing from some Indigenous groups that they're interested in becoming owners of a potential pipeline. So I think Northern Gateway, when it was canceled, I think a third of it was equity owned, like by Indigenous people. So it's not like we've never seen this before, this kind of buy-in into a pipeline project. And just based on that, I would think there's probably a path forward for Alberta if everybody really wants this. Because we were talking about it last week, I think the economics there's question marks around that. If there's political will and some people willing to lose money, then sure, it could probably happen.
Before we move on to a different topic, I did want to just ask, though, in terms of the kind of politics as it would shape in the House. I know everyone's saying, well, no one wants an election right now. No one wants to go into that. But Davis, as our resident NDP expert, we have a leadership race that will end in March. If you're in a situation where, you get your ducks in a row, you have this NDP that feels like, I don't know, they see some sort of rebound in the polls. I guess anything is better than where they are right now. Do we kind of drop this understanding that, do we kind of change our minds if this government is moving more to the center? You have an NDP with a actual leader. They feel like they might have an issue to rally on. Do we kind of drop by the spring, could we be in a totally different environment where, no one's that scared necessarily of going to an election?
I think you could be absolutely right. I tried to make the case the last time I was on this podcast. I don't know why the NDP doesn't want an election right now, even though they have no money and no leader, which again remain big issues. Yeah, I think from everyone I talked to within the NDP, they can see, they can read polls like the rest of us. They know they're not in a great spot right now and that they're still kind of reeling after what was the worst electoral loss in their party's history this past April. But there seems to be this balancing act between keeping that in mind and this sense of optimism that the way that Carney has started governing over the last 8 months provides a real opportunity for the NDP to provide a strong, progressive alternative. Whether that's true or if they're just saying that to try and kind of boost their own hopes, I think that remains to be seen. But it's even noticeable covering parliamentary committees that there seems to be a voice, not necessarily missing, because the Bloc do ask questions on probably behalf of Canada's progressives, but most of them are obviously central to Quebec's interests and not the national discussion. So I think New Democrats remain optimistic, and if the polling starts to turn, again, it remains to be seen. Maybe that'll start to happen in BC and maybe even Quebec. I don't know. That seems unlikely, but following the MOU, there could be changes there. Maybe they're willing to pull the trigger. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. And I think the debate as to whether we will have an election next year is less speculative than the discussion we had ahead of the budget this year and seems like a much more legitimate possibility.
And I guess, again, it's a perfect segue, as we talk about where things are going to stand or potential changes that might make an election more possible in 2026. I wanted to kind of shift gears to talking about the trade talks, and I should say the lack of trade talks. We're told that, there were some rumblings that maybe Carney might make a trip over to DC for the World Cup draw this week. How does that dynamic play into it, Brian? Am I reading too much into this thing, thinking, if I'm Mark Carney, I don't want to wait till next fall when we're going to have a midterm election in the U.S. I know Canadians may not follow American politics super, super closely. You could argue they follow it more closely than our own politics, but knowing that he could face a drubbing in those midterms and that might weaken politically, do you want to go, or do you want to have some movement on that front before next fall? Are you planning to run against this guy again? Walk me through your thinking when it comes to how Carney plays this Canada-U.S. issue, which doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
Well, I think the Canada-U.S. issue is still a strong issue for him, despite the government's ineffectiveness of getting anything done regarding it. We just saw Algoma make its announcement this week. At the end of the day, we're continuing to get hammered by U.S. tariffs. But at the end of the day, I do believe that Prime Minister Carney is the beneficiary of Donald Trump being in power. I think that is one of the things that they are counting on and may want to go next year. I think the economy is going to be a big factor. I think while young people still don't feel like they can afford a home, this is about affordability. This is about the economy and jobs. And so it's not a great environment for the government. You see the conservative numbers are still holding fairly high. And even with Pierre's likability numbers being quite low, the Conservative Party's numbers are holding fairly close to the Liberal Party's numbers. It doesn't strike me as a spot where anybody really wants to go to an election right now. 2026, a lot of things can happen in the next 6 months, Marco. You just never know. Like, you got the Danielle Smith factor now with pipelines and the environmental side of it with the Liberals. Like, there's so much that got to play out from the decisions that the Prime Minister and the government has made in its first 11 months that I think we'll start seeing it kind of play out in the next 6 months. So it's going to be an interesting year. There's definitely, in my opinion, a potential for an election in any minority parliament that's this close. You see mistakes happen, right? You got guys hiding behind curtains. It's not because everybody thinks like they know exactly where the count's going to go. I do have a question to throw back at Davis, though, like, because like, who's going to be the NDP leader and how is that going to impact it? Like, the Bloc and the Liberals must feel pretty good having an NDP leader that can't speak French, first of
Brian,
all.
we talked. They were terrific on this. Did you hear them? I think they all
was terrific.
6
When
words.
you say they don't have a leader, I think he's the guy they should be going with right now. But like, and if it's Heather McPherson, who's a very principled lady, but an Alberta NDPer is not a traditional NDPer that you would have got out of Quebec or downtown Toronto. Like, how does this impact it? And I think this could have a real impact on where things go too, right?
It's a really interesting question. I was talking to Don Davies yesterday in his office for a year-end interview. Stay tuned to iPolitics.ca for more information on that. It's coming out soon. But not to give away the whole interview, but we talked a little bit about the leadership race, and he made the point that the NDP is at a pretty historic moment right now, not at its own choosing, but because they were in such a tough spot after the last election that they kind of really have to rebuild the party from the bottom up. But just exactly what they're building remains to be seen. And a lot of that is dependent on who ends up becoming the leader. And he made the point that the leadership contestants all offer very different visions for the party and seem to hold relatively different values, even though the first debate, they seem to be agreeing with each other all the time. Heather McPherson, obviously the only elected MP, like you said, an Albertan. She's shown a willingness to support pipelines in the past. Makes sense given her base, and has also made comments about trying to broaden the NDP's tent and really bringing in more of the Canadian left into their fold. Avi Lewis, Don Davies compared him to Zoran Mamdani, the recently elected mayor of New York City, and the kind of energy and youth appeal that he brings, I suppose. Obviously, he's more of the activist wing of the NDP. And then Rob Ashton, the third of the main contenders, speaks to its blue-collar workers. I don't think I've ever heard him utter a sentence that doesn't say the word workers or the labor in it. That he seems to be really focused on that. And depending on who gets elected, I think that has different repercussions for the various parties. Again, it remains to be seen how effective Rob Ashton would be as a politician or a leader in general. He's never been elected other than as a union president. But you have to think, a guy that focused on meat and potatoes issues, is that concerning for Pierre Poilievre and some of those orange-blue ridings in Northern Ontario and BC that we've seen become more staunchly conservative in the last few elections? Is a leader like Rob Ashton able to bring them back to the orange side? I don't know, but that's a really interesting question moving forward, and I guess we'll find out in March what direction the party goes.
And I just kind of bringing it a bit back to Canada, US. I know that so much of your work is obviously focused on major projects and how this is a way to kind of blunt the impact of the turmoil or upheaval caused by the Americans. If that goes away, which I'm not speculating that it will be, does that kind of just, like, I don't know, stall our momentum? Like, do we just become less focused on scrapping these whatever environmental protections, whatever we're going to do in terms of fast tracking these projects? Or does it not have any impact? Are we just like, can't really trust Donald Trump, so as long as this guy's in the White House, there's going to be this impetus to get big projects done?
Yeah, I'd have to review the exact language in the law, but I think the national interest designation expires after 5 years. So there's only like a 5-year window to see how that process of bypassing existing regulations and having that fast track regulatory streamlining is going to work. I feel like it would only make sense to just keep going in that direction should the US threat go away just because you got the ball rolling, might as well keep it going. You already built this momentum by putting the spotlight on certain projects and getting the national conversation more focused on, independence with critical minerals, and then the whole energy superpower ambition as well is a good talking point politically. So I can't imagine that you're not going to return to that, even if the geopolitical context changes. There was so much conversation about, does Mark Carney care? Because he said, who cares, right? When he was asked about trade talks with the US. And I couldn't help but think that he tried right at the beginning. He had this friendly, conciliatory approach. It didn't really go anywhere. Donald Trump is saying, I want to be a great man too. Maybe I feel like that's part of the strategy, is to look like you don't care, to look like you're not desperate for a deal as a way to make yourself more appealing. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing last week when reporters were so desperate to say, have you been texting Trump? Tell me. And he was making fun of us. He was like, oh, I can't tell you. No emoji on this text. It's not newsworthy. So I think he's going to keep with that strategy of looking like he doesn't need to have a deal, although we all know, as Brian pointed out, Algoma Steel laying off 1,000 workers this week, that a deal is needed. Although I thought the reports coming out of the US this week were really interesting about how the manufacturing sector there is politely telling Trump that he should renew CUSMA, that it's benefited the industry greatly. And we've also seen him roll back on certain tariffs because of the pressure of raising prices at the grocery store. So maybe his political context is changing too.
I do think it's fascinating. Like, here we are talking about these global trade issues, and it comes down to how often you guys texting? What's the tone of the text message? Are you playing hard to get, Mr. Carney? Answer our questions.
Have you given him a gold bar? But it does raise the point, though, Marco and I, that Carney's in a tough spot because politically, Canadians want him elbows up fighting. That hasn't changed. Canadians have been very clear in polling. They want us to take a more aggressive stance like Doug Ford has taken with Donald Trump. But it's also very clear the only countries in the world that get any kind of deal with them are the ones that go hat in hand and beg their way into the White House. So it leaves them in this spot where just not being present and trying to take that away is the way I think that they feel like they have to deal with this. But because politically, this is a big loser for them to go in and get a bad deal while being seen to be weak.
Yeah, and Davis, I want to bring you here on this. I don't want to ask you if you think Mark Carney should double text Donald Trump, but do you, the longer this thing goes on, the more, I guess, tension gets put on some of these, industries, and you can start seeing, you had a terrific story a couple of weeks ago about how some premiers and some industry representatives are saying, Mark Carney's not really keeping us in the loop here. You think the longer this thing drags on, the more risk that this Team Canada approach starts, coming together at the seams, especially in BC, for example, where they're like, how come you're focusing on steel and aluminum and not softwood? Or maybe it's Ontario and you're not getting a deal done to help autos. Do you think there's any risk that the longer this thing drags on, the more disunity you are going to see amongst the premiers, and that's going to kind of weaken our position?
Yeah, you kind of beat me to the punch. I was going to turn the tables and ask you pretty much the same thing, because I do think it shows the question I have is about transparency. And obviously you alluded to the story I wrote about where premiers and stakeholders who think of themselves and are, technically speaking, advisors to the Prime Minister aren't really sure what exactly is going on. And when I talk about transparency, I don't necessarily mean whether he's texting, whether they're up late, chatting with each other. I honestly don't really know if I need to know that. But just the question of what exactly we're working towards at this point. What do we want anymore? I'm not entirely clear. Obviously when Carney was elected, there was all this talk about a new comprehensive deal, and we saw the EU and Japan and other trading partners get more general deals that kind of reworked and outlines the trading relationship moving forward between the US and those respective jurisdictions. Quickly seemed like it wasn't going to be on the table for Canada, and then we started working towards these smaller kind of sectoral based deals on steel and aluminum, and then Doug Ford's marketing ploy poo-pooed that. So I just don't know what we're striving towards anymore. There's lots of chatter about whether Carney and Trump will restart trade talks next week at the World Cup draw. By the way, did Italy get in, Marco? I still don't know where we stand on that. Okay.
Hold on. Now we're scrappy here. We're
not
out just yet.
at the end of the day, I just don't know, even if we do restart trade talks, I don't know what the end goal is that we're working towards here. Is it a larger deal? Is it smaller deals? Is it just, are we just trying to lay some good groundwork before the Kuzma review next year? I would appreciate a little more clarity on it.
Yeah, and I will say, because I know Brian's going to beat me to the punch, I know you're saying this ad campaign isn't successful. According to Doug Ford, it was incredibly successful. It just happened to harpoon our trade deal opportunities. I know what you're talking about. The Premier seems to think it was a very successful ploy, but it was a point that Goldie Heyer, head of the Canada Business Council, made to me, which was, if the status quo is okay, you got to say it. If not, you got to kind of give us some insights in terms of what we're working towards, I think, to your point, Davis, but also, like, where do we see, within the context of what's plausible and what's realistic, what are we working towards? So if it's a deal that includes some degree of tariffs, you got to tell us, hey guys, and Mark Carney has kind of signaled this, but in a way that isn't really kind of holding his feet to the fire, being like, we'll probably have to have a deal with tariffs. Okay, but that's, that maybe that's okay saying that 3-4 months into your term, as this thing continues to drag on, you got to, if you are comfortable with that, you got to say so. And then we got to work towards that deal. You have to prepare Canadians, I think, for that next step. And I think if you think, no, I'm not going to accept any deal that includes tariffs or anything that, contradicts Kuzma, or I'm just going to wait until next year for the Kuzma renegotiation, again, you got to be clear. So I think a lot of people are saying that same thing, Davis, that if you don't have, you're in a difficult spot with Trump, that's one thing. And I know you don't want to negotiate in public, but you got to give us some signal in terms of what the goal is. You don't got to tell us necessarily what's on the table, but you got to tell us what you're working towards.
Yeah, I just don't know. Brian and I'd be curious on your guys' thoughts on this. I just don't know what Pierre Poilievre is supposed to do with this, even though Carney, in theory, should be politically vulnerable on this issue because he came in talking a big game and saying he was the best person to handle Trump, and he did not, to this point, not end up signing any sort of deal. Is there any political room for Poilievre? It's a tough issue to come up with a real alternative resolution when so far all he's been able to say is I would push for a deal with no tariffs. But I think most Canadians view Donald Trump as an irrational actor, so they're not putting the blame at Mark Carney's feet. So there's not a lot of room to criticize him if you're Pierre Poilievre. Is that fair, Brian, or what advice would you give him?
Well, I think there's room to criticize, but I think the way that they do it and the tone in which they do it could change to be more beneficial. But I think time is what's going to help the Conservative Party and all the opposition parties in this. I think the Prime Minister has set out a bunch of things that he has no real control over. Like whether he gets a deal with Donald Trump or not, and whether it's a good deal, is very little control that the Prime Minister has of this. But it is clearly the core essence of his last campaign, right? And I think time is only going to hurt him in that regard. I think that when it comes to major projects, I've said this in the past, I think picking and choosing winners of corporate welfare lotteries is a poor way to approach things. And I think it may end up not delivering the results that, the generational hinge moment results that the Prime Minister is looking for. It's time that you need to see all that come out. To the point we were talking about earlier, if you end up with an election somewhere in 2026, that's not necessarily enough time to really see the results of some of these things. It's like the pipeline MOU, right? It all sounds good in the moment. Good policy shows results over time, and I'm not sure that you're going to see that from some of the things that are going on within this government, especially some of their major the major components with the major project side of it, as well as Canada-US relationships.
I will say one thing, that I think this whole thing, Carney won because he basically told Canadians he was going to get a deal. I disagree with that. I think if you look at the polling, a lot of the reason why Pierre Poilievre, his popularity maybe shrunk a bit was the sense that if Pierre Poilievre wins, he's so like Donald Trump, he's going to go there and kiss the ring. And I think this is what pollsters were saying. It's like, the problem with Poilievre is he seemed too close to like Donald Trump. They basically suck up to him. So I don't know if it's necessarily people expected Mark Carney to get a deal done. So they expected Mark Carney not to suck up and apologize to the president like we've seen. And Davis, I know you didn't mean to do it, but you kind of ignored Quebec, in that the Bloc Québécois leader, Yves-François Blanchet, has also been very critical, saying, I think he said we bought a lemon with Mark Carney. Might be unfair to say that 8 months in, but you're you're more attuned to the Quebec dynamic down there. What do you think about Blanchette's, out of the gate open criticism that, we've seen enough from Mark Carney. Let's pack it up. This guy really kind of sold us as a total lemon when it comes to dealing with Donald Trump. You think that, that has any audience in Quebec, or you think he's just trying to, be an opposition leader? I was asking you.
I thought it was Adidas. Yeah, I mean, I thought like just last week when the MOU details came out and Yves-François Blanchet had this presser, he was saying, "On va mener une lutte sans merci. We will fight a merciless struggle." What a strong choice of words. But yes, and too, like listening to Guilbeault at Tout le monde en parle on Sunday, I kept thinking, like, there's no way that this isn't a blow to the Liberals in Quebec. Having Guilbeault, who's popular, who's experienced, who's a household name, looking into your eyes and telling you our country is not going to meet its 2030 targets. It's as clear as you could ever say to a province for whom climate commitments matter very much. I can't imagine that's not going to hurt Carney in some way. And I think he kind of goes a bit with the lemon comment where, this is a prime minister who wrote values. This is a prime minister who was, the envoy at the UN for climate finance. And, that accounted in the reasons why he was elected, why he has support in Quebec. And now there's this rollback on all these policies. I do really wonder how Quebec is going to vote if there's an election soon.
And it does seem like, unlike, I'm not trying to be dismissive of the NDP, but it seems like in Quebec, it's in Ontario, for example, if you're like, oh, I want to choose the greenest option between the major parties, like you really kind of shift from the Liberals to the Conservatives. Whereas in Quebec, it seems like correct me if I'm wrong, the Bloc is still that viable option where it's like, oh, well, I want someone who's going to be a bit more vocal on this, someone who has a realistic possibility of winning my riding or my seat. I'm going to maybe park my vote with the Bloc. Are they still seen as a very viable option, even though they lost, 10 seats in the last vote?
Yeah, they didn't get wiped out though, and in an election where it was vote Liberal or Conservatives, they stood their ground more so than the NDP, right? So I think they would have room to grow, especially that they have been positioning themselves as leaders of climate movement concerns in the country. And I would imagine if I was part of their communication strategy for the next election, I would be, putting a lot of weight on that as I go campaigning door to door for sure.
We are quickly running out of time, so I will skip to the conclusion and ask all of you the question I ask at the end of every podcast. Looking back at the week that we just had or looking ahead, talk to me about one thing you're looking, really caught your attention. We'll start with Davis. I know the NDP leadership race debate was high up on that list, but is there anything else maybe that could be competing for that top spot?
There was a lot to choose from the past week. The one thing that we didn't mention yet that I think will be interesting to watch is the reintegration of Mark Miller as a federal cabinet minister. And I don't think there's questions necessarily surrounding Mark Miller's individual performance. I think I could be wrong here, Brian, you'll have to let me know. I think he's pretty well respected around Parliament Hill from what I hear. And obviously he's an experienced cabinet minister. I know some people have taken issue with his performance in previous files, but just the lengths that Mark Carney went to at the start of his term to show that this was a different government, that this was a different administration, that the remnants of Justin Trudeau's 10-year tenure were going to be wiped from the slate. They seem to be creeping back in. Whether those comparisons are fair or not, I think that'll just be interesting to watch, see how that plays out. There's rumors that there will be another larger cabinet shuffle, perhaps in the new year. Just a storyline to keep an eye on.
I think that's a good point, Davis. I will say, though, it's funny because Mark Miller, literally childhood friends with Justin Trudeau. And, I don't know if Canadians would make that kind of quick comparison, like, oh, you're bringing back that guy. Oh, Justin Trudeau's legacy hasn't left. Whereas Steven Guilbeault, who probably carries a lot of the baggage for some of these controversial policies like carbon tax, that guy's out the door. Do Canadians think Trudeau's back because Mark Miller's here, or do they think Trudeau is left the building because Steven Guilbeault has packed his bag? So maybe we're just confusing. Maybe the signals are just contradicting each other.
I think that's a much better point. Just disregard what I said. I like that a lot better.
I will say, though, one of the things in terms of, I do agree with Davis's view that Mark Miller, and Brian, you can disagree with me if you choose so, is seen as very well respected. I remember soon after the first, I think it was like the first month or two with the new cabinet, 2 or 3 people I talked to unprompted said they wish Miller was back on immigration just because of how good of a communicator he was. He definitely seems to be getting some acknowledgement that he's very good on his feet. and is good at doing the actual job of being a minister. But Brian, I don't know if you disagree with me on that.
Well, look, is he a good communicator? Is he a well-spoken parliamentarian? It seems like he is, and it's probably why he was the choice to be in cabinet. Was he the immigration minister that, created such a backlash against immigration in this country and has made it such a political issue?
I would argue that was Sean Fraser's doing more than. I feel like he was the guy who kind of had to pull in the reins.
But where's Sean Fraser at now? He's in cabinet too.
Had a promotion.
I mean, I'm not saying the results are as important when you're a minister as the way you communicate.
No, that's fair. Anyway, sorry, Brian. What are you looking forward to, or what did you want to reflect on?
I shamelessly am plugging Queen's Park Briefing this week. I talked to you about a Matthew Lau's piece, scholar at the Fraser Institute. I thought it was spectacular. Just to prove to you that I don't care whether it's red spending or blue spending. The amount of spending that Matthew Lau has identified per GDP has actually increased under the Ford government since Kathleen Wynne's last budget. And $10 billion in corporate welfare, direct checks to, ice cream plants and other things in Ontario. I think this is a really dangerous path that we're going down, especially when you look at the predictions of the GDP slowing to 1% in Ontario next year. Government's got to get their spending under control, and they got to be more principled with this stuff, especially when you're a government that likes to say that you're doing a good job on maintaining your budgets and being fiscally responsible, but when it's proven otherwise, it's a problem. And so I loved it. I loved his take on taxation and how it's affecting the Ontario economy. So I recommend everybody go read that piece in Queen's Park Briefing. Well done.
And Brian, you've raised this point about, the concerns around, so-called Red Doug and the fact that he seems to be acting like a quote unquote liberal. Does it hurt him, or is he just, since the Liberals have been so weakened, the NDP seems to be falling more steadily behind in the polls, and definitely you wouldn't think people thinking, oh, I'm concerned about government spending, so therefore I'm going to vote for a party pledging a lot more in that regard. Do you think it really matters? Like, it's really going to dent his popularity?
Well, listen, to be clear, I didn't call him Red Doug. That's your forum.
I was going to go with Chairman Doug, but...
But at the end of the day, when you look at it, they talk about Kathleen Wynne's reckless spending. They talk about how they're doing such a good job getting the books under control in Ontario. Well, the numbers don't show that. The audits from the Auditor General don't show that. At some point in time, do I think it's hurting him politically? No, because I think the opposition, like we talk about Pierre's drive on certain things. Well, like when he talked about taxation, when he talks about overspending, how it affects inflation, I don't think that message, I don't even think the opposition tries to get that message out in Ontario, because usually they're asking for more spending, which is kind of the scary part of Ontario politics. As we've talked about in the past, it's so important when you take into the context of our debt and our deficit in Canada, you have to take in the context of the provincial debt that is out there as well. And Ontario, being the largest province, is the biggest contributor of that. And we have to unleash the Ontario economy. Alberta and Saskatchewan and the West can only do so much to outpace their population. Ontario, we've got to unleash that growth, and it's not going to happen if we're picking winners and losers by the government.
No, that's a good point. Aya, what about you? Is there anything reflecting the past 7 days or things you're looking forward to in the next week?
Yeah, I think I've bored you guys with this detail already, but it's so interesting that enhanced oil recovery is now part of the activities that fall under some tax credits for carbon capture. So, carbon capture, you can either put it in the ground and never think about it again, or you can take it and use it for something else. And the oil industry, one way to make carbon capture economically viable is to pump it into old wells and then that give a second life on those oil rigs that weren't pumping enough anymore. Now the government is offering some support for that kind of activity, and it's counterintuitive because the goal of capturing carbon is to remove it from the atmosphere. But by using it for enhanced oil recovery, then you're emitting more carbon. So the solution that I'm hearing from industry is we need to build even more carbon capture. And so this is going to be a very interesting conversation, especially that these projects don't happen without some kind of support, some kind of taxpayer dollar funding. And I'm going to be exploring all that in our next adjournment proceedings piece coming out on Friday.
Absolutely. And this is something that Elizabeth May, she said, Steven Guilbeault told me it was going to be kept off the plate. And now it seems like the Alberta MOU walks that back. So they'll have to also deal with the fury of a vengeful Elizabeth May. Watch out, guys.
I'm terrified.
David knows that feeling. I guess, in terms of what I'm kind of looking to, I'm going to also shamelessly plug our work here at iPolitics. Spoke to a bunch of people this week about the kind of mood in the room around Caucus, not necessarily specifically tied to the Alberta MOU, but just generally how Mark Carney is going about doing his business. And there do seem to be those early rumblings where Caucus is a bit concerned about being left out of the loop. I'm really curious to see how that kind of plays out. I don't know if we'll see any resignations. I feel like a lot of people have, who want to believe that Mark Carney is on their side when it comes to issues like climate. We're quick to defend him out the gate, saying the MOU is just a plan about a plan, trying to dismiss those concerns. But I do think that that's governing style where you don't consult with people when you tell them what you're going to do and then expect them to jump on. Some people have told me that that's going to have some consequences that you can't expect. And Brian, you would know this better than anyone, that you can't expect Caucus to go along with you blindly. And then, further down the line, when you need that solidarity and support, just to think that, oh, of course they're going to line up with me. Like right now, Mark Carney's riding high in the polls. That won't always be the case, but he's clearly shown a signal that he's going to do what he's going to do. And you're either going to get on the train or get run over by it. So I'm very curious to see how that shakes out. I'm very curious to see if anything else comes out of the kind of rumblings around the MOU and whether we see, that chorus kind of get louder. If they continue, if Caucus, if they feel like I don't have anyone to vent to other than media, whether or not, that kind of hurts the Carney government's, influence by hearing these rumors about turmoil within Caucus. So something I'll be paying close attention to.
I think it's a great point, Marco. It's not just turmoil within Caucus, turmoil within cabinet. Like,
yes,
this is a senior cabinet minister that resigned his portfolio and essentially ended his political career for the most part, out of principle. Doesn't happen very often. And it shows a real issue and a real concern, I think, within the Liberal caucus and Liberal base. Now, I'll give you a quick story. It's Brent Rathgaber, when Chris Workington kind of helped push him out of caucus over the CBC Sunshine List. He was adding CBC to the Sunshine List in his bill, which the Harper government didn't support. He would walk around at the gym, in the parliamentary gym, because we were in a minority at the time, and he'd be like, guys, just need 7 brave souls and we can expose CBC, 7 brave souls. Brent Rathgaber ended up going out all on his own sword. Not one of us backed him on it, right? I don't think you're going to get a lot of caucus support when it comes to these things. So
no, I think that's a really good point. Something Aya and I have been talking a lot about is, sure, maybe caucus might not, they have their own political careers to worry about, but this kind of more flippant or less concern around consultation with Indigenous peoples, there might be some real consequences there. I don't think Tim Hodgson's response that, hey, let's chat over Zoom, really found a receptive audience. And I think it speaks to his limitations as a politician too, or his lack of experience. This stuff that we're talking about isn't something you do. You don't get a quick 15 with the energy minister. It's kind of part of our whole constitution in terms of the need for Indigenous consultation. Now, you could say there's not a pipeline, so you don't necessarily need to, it hasn't really engaged in there. But considering where we were with the Trudeau government, definitely seems to be a big kind of shift in approach. I say that as we're all on a video chat right now. So
let's Zoom.
Maybe Tim has a point. But thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back here next week talking once again all about everything within Canadian politics. Thanks.
Thanks, Marco.
Thanks, Marco.
Bye, everyone.